So yeah, thanks for the introduction. My name is Dave, and I'm going to talk to you this morning about designing your user interface of your application for discoverability. And I want to start by taking you back more than 10 years to the introduction of the iPhone. And when it was introduced, Steve Jobs made a bold claim that it was a revolutionary new device. And it was one of those claims that actually was true. It really was unlike anything people had seen before. And with revolutionary new devices, especially with revolutionary new user interfaces, they tend to be kind of hard to use at first. But the iPhone wasn't that. It was very easy to use in terms of the basics of getting the user interface working. And that was a lot of the reason for that was because of it was direct manipulation of the user interface on the screen of the phone that you were using. So when you tap a button, you put your finger on the button on the screen and you tap it, and it's a very, very obvious thing to happen. When you scroll a list, you put your finger on the screen, you move the list, and it moves underneath your finger. But that's not everything that needed solving with this new device. And while the basics of the user interface were very easy to use, we lost a lot compared to where we'd come from in terms of discoverability of our applications. So if you look, for example, at a Mac application, if we look at TextEdit, if you open up TextEdit on a new document, then you'll be presented with this window with a blank content area with just a flashing cursor. But already, even just at that basic level of seeing that window, there are lots of, the operating system has given us lots of clues as to what to do. There's a toolbar there, which is full of buttons that we can explore and use. And there's also a menu bar at the top. So that menu bar is there as a standard interface element on every Mac application. And on that menu bar is a very intriguing looking menu option called Help. And so you think, well, if you are brand new to this application, well, maybe that's where I should start. And sure enough, if you go up to that Help menu, you'll be able to open up a TextEdit user guide. And there's a wonderful amount of documentation and guides on how to use this application that nobody has ever read. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. It is there if you want it. But even better than that, a lot of the user interface on the Mac is just designed to be discoverable. That menu bar that I talked about before, that has a huge amount of discoverability baked into it, where you just go and you kind of browse through the menu of a new application, and straight away, it's going to tell you some of the things that application can do. Even better than that is context menus. Type some text, you select it, you right-click, and it's going to give you commands that you can use to customize that text or do something with that text. There's a huge amount of discoverability built in. And with the iPhone, we lost a lot of that because the size of the screen is just so much smaller that there's no room for help books. There's no menu bar, there's no context menus, there's no right-click, there's no click. It's a completely different device. And it's hard to remember back to the beginning there of when this device was introduced, just how different some of the user interface elements were. And in fact, there's a bit in the original introduction of the iPhone that I want to play with some audio here. And it was the first time that pinch to zoom was demonstrated. And if you hadn't ever seen somebody pinch the screen to zoom something in, at the time it was a very alien concept. As soon as you saw someone do it, it was very obvious, and it's a good gesture for that. But I just want to take you back with some...
I can just take my fingers and we call it the pinch. I can bring them closer together or move them further apart to make it bigger or smaller. And so I can just move them further apart and stretch the image.
So I don't know whether you heard them, but when he pinches the screen for the first time, the audience like audibly gasps. There's like an intake of breath. Like, we'll never go back to that because obviously that feels like a completely obvious gesture. now. But at the time, it really wasn't. And a lot of what Apple was faced with when this device was new was educating people on how to use the phone and how to use the applications on the phone. This is a brand new type of device, and I love the way that Apple kind of set about doing this. And they used their marketing at the time to double as half marketing and half education. So if you look back at any of the early adverts for the iPhone, it was always a hand holding a phone and then just somebody using the features of the phone. And over the top was a voiceover that would talk about it and market the phone. But a lot of what you actually saw on screen was someone just using the phone, and that was reinforcing those basic UI concepts over and over again. And in fact, again, there's an advert I want to play you with some audio here, which really demonstrates this very nicely.
The iPhone 4S has an all-new camera with 8 megapixels and advanced optics. So it lets you capture stunning photos. And because it's an iPhone, you can do things no ordinary camera can do. So maybe the only camera you need is the one on the most amazing iPhone yet.
So that's a 30-second advertisement. And it is very much an advertisement. You're supposed to look at that and think, I would really like to buy that product. But at the same time, they actually demonstrate 9 individual features of the camera in the most subtle way ever. There are really subtle little bits, like, for example, when the user zooms into the photo, they also zoom and then just very slightly rotate. And there's no accident in that, because without that, you might not know that you could, for example, finally rotate a phone. But seeing somebody do it for the first time is instantly obvious. And so what I want to talk about for the rest of my session today is how to sell your product through multinational TV advertising campaigns. No, this is not what I'm going to talk about, you'll be pleased to hear. This is definitely not a new problem, though. And what I am going to talk about is some of the ways that we can, in our own applications, design the user interfaces so that people know inherently how to use our applications. And like I say, this is not a new problem. This is something that we've been dealing with from the very beginning. And we fairly quickly settled into a very common user interface pattern, which is empty state screens. And I'm not going to talk about these very much today because these have been done many, many times. But this became very standard to open up a new application. Quite often, iPhone applications at their core are going to be some kind of list, and that list is eventually going to show you something. Empty state screens solve 2 problems. The first problem they solve is that you're not presented with just a blank screen of content. They give the user something to look at and some guidance on what to do first. And they're fine. And we used empty state screens for a long time. And in fact, they're still valid today. But they are just one aspect of discoverability. It's like, what should my first action within this application be? But we have moved on a little bit from there. And we have settled very much into a standard way of introducing our applications in terms of how people could use them and what they do. And the first thing you often see when you launch a new application is this. And as soon as you see this, you know that you're on a path to seeing a walkthrough of the application. So first you'll see some feature, then another feature, and then you'll get sold the premium upgrade. And then finally, you will be able to use the application. So walkthroughs have become very standard, and they're fine. Again, they're not particularly bad, but they're also not perfect, because if you think about the state of mind that a user is in when they first launch your application, they're potentially quite excited to use your application. They've just downloaded it from the App Store, and through the miracle of that whole process, they've been able to take their intention to buy an application to having it running in front of them in a matter of seconds. They're excited to do whatever task they were intending to do with your app. And suddenly, what you're asking them to do is not do what they wanted to do, but walk through 12 screens of every single feature that your application has, interrupting what their intention was to explain every corner of your application. So you're disrupting that process for them. And they're not actually that great for discovery, because quite often when users are presented like this, who's ever swiped through one of these walkthroughs as quickly as they can, right? Yeah, it's like the swiping Olympics, right? It's how fast can I get this? Or if there's a skip button, even better, I'm just going to tap the skip button. It's no wonder that we have fallen into this, because who are one of the biggest companies that we see, and a company that I've already told you that we can watch for inspiration. Well, Apple do this all the time. And in fact, in iOS 13, these opening walkthrough screens are even more prevalent. I don't think there's a single Apple first-party application that doesn't use some kind of screen like this. They all look basically the same. They're all going to show you a few features. The Apple ones, they never have multiple pages. They're always just one page with 3 or 4 bullet point features, and they all look roughly like this. Sometimes it's what's new. Sometimes it's just some basic features of the application. So it's no wonder that we've kind of taken this kind of approach to discoverability in our third-party applications. But it's not ideal. And I don't think, again, I'm not saying don't do these, but don't rely on this as your discoverability. But there are some new features in iOS 13 that also cater to discoverability. And Apple are starting to move discoverability into the rest of the operating system, which I think is a step forward. For example, the first time you when you upgrade to iOS 13, and the first time you see a keyboard, you'll actually see this animation over the top of the keyboard, which is showing people how to use the new swipe keyboard. So you swipe across a word to type it. It's been around on Android for a long time. I don't think this is an ideal way to do discoverability, because, again, we're interrupting the user here. So the most likely thing that the user is doing when they see this is they're probably sending a message, because most people use the messaging facilities on their phone, whether it's iMessage or WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever it is. Messaging is a huge use. And so again, the user, in their state of mind when they see this animation, is that they have a task to do, and this is actually going to get in the way of that task. And so covering over the keyboard with something like this is actually just begging the user to say, well, I'm just going to hit this continue button. And in fact, if you talk to people, who here thinks they've never seen this animation? Must be a few people who think they've never seen it. A lot of people, you just see this and instantly tap away, because it's not what you were intending to do at the time, and it's just getting in the way. And once this has been dismissed once, you'll never see it again. There was actually another one in iOS 13, which was for the undo gesture, the 3-finger undo gesture. I'm sure that I did see that, but I can't remember it, because I was obviously in the middle of doing something else when that was presented to me. We'll come back to this later and see how maybe there was maybe a different way that Apple could have approached the discoverability of this feature. But before we do, I want to look at a few more problems. And one of the biggest problems that Apple have with discoverability is actually Siri. So a voice assistant has no user, well, it has a user interface. The interface is a conversation. But in terms of prompting people to figure out how to use that user interface is really a very, very difficult task. And again, if we go back to one of the opening adverts when Apple first introduced Siri, you can see again how they're really focusing on how you'd actually interact with this. And look at all the different, when I play this advert in a second, look at all the different ways that they're invoking Siri and the ways that they're using Siri in lots of different ways. And it's absolutely to educate you on some of the different ways you can use it.
What's my day look like?
Not bad. Only 2 meetings today.
Can I walk to the Belvedere Hotel from here?
Here are directions to Belvedere Hotel.
Read me that text.
New message from Sarah Russell. See you soon.
Do you think it will snow today?
It sure looks like snow today.
Say hello to Siri on the most amazing iPhone yet.
A voice assistant really has a very difficult user interface to teach people. And from the very beginning, Apple have started to put user interface into the phone to help you with that. For example, if you invoke Siri and then don't say anything, you'll have probably seen this screen appear a few times. And this is great because it's not actually getting in the way of what you were trying to do. You've invoked Siri and then haven't told it what to do. So at this point, it is actually a great opportunity to show the user a bit of education about how to use the feature. But the user has already thought about using Siri at this point, and then they're just not quite sure what to say. So while it is good, and you'll have certainly seen this screen appear, it's never going to push that Siri feature into the mind of someone who isn't currently thinking about Siri. But in iOS 13, the Siri team especially have started to really lean into making Siri discoverable across the whole user interface. So in the Messages application, after you've upgraded, you might see this. Now this will be at the top of your list of messages, and it's a dismissible alert. So this is not going to interrupt what you're doing. This is an optional piece of education that you can read. If you want to just scroll past this, tap on the conversation you were interested in, and write your message, that's absolutely fine. If you want to get rid of it, you dismiss it, you'll never see it again. That's a great concept for thinking about discoverability in your own applications. How am I not going to interrupt what the user is doing, but at the same time make them able to read something or see something about using my application that's going to make their life a little easier? And that's not the only place that the Siri team have started to put this discoverability in. If you swipe down into Spotlight and start typing, you'll see lots of different little hints at the bottom of the search results there of what Siri can do. So I was typing in settings here, and it's going to give me an example of something I can do in settings with Siri. If you're driving and you have Do Not Disturb while driving switched on, it's now going to just prompt you, instead of actually unlocking a phone, maybe you should use Siri. And I really like the way that these are peppered around the operating systems. There's nothing, there's no specific place that you can go to get this education, but it is just there to remind you that these features exist. And I think that's a great way to think about discoverability in your own applications. It's peppered around other aspects of the system as well. For example, the first time you launch the health application, especially on a new device, you'll see these two prompts, and potentially more as well. So some of these are advertising new features in iOS 13, like the cycle tracking. Some of them are advertising features that have been around for a long time, but that maybe you haven't quite set up yet. Again, always dismissible, always optional. You could just scroll past these. And it's a good way to think about discoverability in that these almost look a little bit like advertisements, right? You're advertising features and aspects of your application that people might not know about. So let's go back to that screen that did interrupt people. I said this was not an ideal placement for discoverability because you're replacing the keyboard with this animation, which potentially is just going to get people to skip past it. I think that Apple could potentially have made this into a better piece of discovery if, instead of replacing the keyboard with it, maybe the first few times that you use the keyboard after you've upgraded, there's maybe something that's just above the keyboard or somewhere else on the screen that says something like, for example, swipe instead of tap, learn more. To have that little kind of call to action to learn a little bit more about a potential new feature, which at the point where you tap learn more, they could then at that point replace the keyboard with this thing, and you're in the mood then to learn. It feels like it's your idea to learn something about the user interface. And at that point, you're much more receptive to actually paying attention to what's happening. So there's lots of ways where you can make discoverability an optional part of your user interface rather than forcing people in like a walkthrough or replacing the keyboard or something like that. So I like these kind of dismissible little adverts for different features in your application. And I want to talk about what you might want to advertise through this kind of user interface, when you might want to do that advertising to the user, and where you might want to place them as well. So let's look at the what first of all. You might think that the most obvious thing to advertise, given that you've probably got an existing application already, is new features. And that's maybe true. These kind of prompts are great for prompting users to use the new feature that you've just added to your application. But it's not only about that. Maybe you actually want to educate people on the basic features of your application. Well, now you might be thinking, well, there are actually so many different things that I could advertise to my users here. Which one do I actually pick? Well, one answer to that is that you can actually figure that out and present different bits of your user interface to different users, depending on, for example, how new they are to your application. You've probably got some kind of analytics in your application to report on feature usage or general usage of your application. And you could potentially leverage some of that analytics data to figure out what kind of user and what stage that user is at through your application. So I might suggest that you would use that kind of information to decide what to advertise to your users. If they're a brand new user to your application, you're probably not going to want to advertise some pro-level feature that only someone who's been using the app for 4 years is actually going to need. Maybe in that case, you present some basic usage tips or something like that to them. You can also use your analytics to figure out which bits of your application are not actually being discovered. So you've probably got analytics in there that are saying, well, this screen and this screen and this screen are getting a whole load of use, but for some reason, users are never actually going into this section of the application. Now, maybe that's because that section of the application isn't doing what they want. Maybe it's not working correctly. Maybe it's not solving the problem that the user had. Or maybe the user just doesn't know about it. So you can actually start to design into your application mechanisms to say, well, let's figure out whether it's because they don't know about the feature or whether it's because that feature doesn't do something that they want it to do. And you can use these discoverability prompts to figure that out. It's kind of pushing people towards various bits of your application. Next thing we're going to talk about is when should you show them? Well, I already talked about the fact that maybe on application startup isn't the perfect time. But actually, maybe it is. And again, this is absolutely dependent on context. And we have a lot of context about what the user is doing in our application just from where they are and how they're using the application at every step. So, for example, we can tell very roughly where a user is without asking for example, location access. I don't need to know the exact location of somebody. But let's say, for example, if the phone is connected to a Wi-Fi network rather than a cellular network, it's more likely that that person is going to be either at home or at their job or somewhere where they have some time to actually use an application properly. If they're on a cellular network, it's more likely, again, none of this is definitive, but it's more likely that they might be in a situation where they might be rushing through something, they might be very quickly trying to get in, get a task done, and get back out of your application. So let's treat that as an opportunity to show or hide these discoverability prompts based on how likely we think a user is to actually respond to them. But also, we really need to be very respectful of people's kind of time and attention when we do this kind of stuff. You know, I'm talking about basically treating these like advertisements in our application. And just like you wouldn't force a full screen advertisement for somebody else's product on somebody as they were using your application, you shouldn't also do it with your own products. So each of these should absolutely be dismissible. And if the user chooses to dismiss this, you're done. Like, never show that again, ever. If I've chosen not to read that, whatever it was that you're trying to push me to read, that's my choice. And I never want to see that again, and I shouldn't ever be forced to read it again. The final question to answer here is where. So the design of every application is obviously very different, and so it's very difficult for me to give you completely generic advice on where to put these prompts. But one place they do really fit very well is in table views. And luckily, in most mobile applications, you've almost always got some kind of table view at some point in your application. But they shouldn't always be in the same place. Because again, if we teach people that the top half of this table view is always going to be an advertisement for some other part of our application, people will just start to blindly kind of tune out that bit of the user interface. So mix up where you show people these prompts. Maybe show, if you've got some kind of settings screen, maybe occasionally show some kind of discoverability prompt in there. Maybe if the rest of your application has table views in it, you can stick one of these in on the main list or in some detail view or some other part of your application. Spread these things around. You might also want to think at this point of, how often should I see one of these? Again, you don't want to just bombard people with hundreds of these little discoverability prompts the entire way through your application. So maybe set some kind of limit. You know, if people have seen 2 of these prompts in one session, maybe don't show them anymore. Maybe wait a few days until the next kind of trigger comes in. And of course, there's a lot of logic that you're going to be building to make all this happen. But you should just be a little bit careful that you don't go over the top with these prompts. So I've talked a lot about context in terms of those prompts and those kind of advertisements for your application. And there's another feature of iOS 13 which has really helped with discoverability, and that is context menus. So one of the features that of older iOS versions that was deprecated in this release was peek and pop, and context menus are the replacement for that. And I really like this feature in terms of, not only is it just a nice feature to use and it's a nice feature to develop with, but it's a great feature in terms of discoverability. Here's some content. I'm going to tap and hold on that content, and I'm going to get a context menu that's going to show me the things that I can do with that content. And Apple have put these context menus all over the application, all over the first-party applications. And this is actually very similar to that feature we were talking about right at the very beginning, which is right-click on a Mac. So this is kind of the spiritual successor, really, to right-click on the Mac, where I'm interacting with some piece of content in this application. The standard gesture has changed. It's no longer a right-click. It's now a touch and hold. But it's going to show me some things that I can do with whatever I'm touching. And Apple have done the first step of this, which is to adopt this user interface convention across a lot of their applications. The next stage is for us to take that the rest of the way and make this something that is standard across the entire operating system, including third-party applications. So think about wherever you can in your application, can you add some kind of context menu so that people, if they're struggling to know what to do with your app, it becomes default for them to touch and hold on something inside your application to discover what it is that people can do. And in fact, if you look at the human interface guidelines, they're suggesting that we do this. So they're saying that we should adopt context menus consistently in our application. And it's only if both Apple and us as third-party developers do this that it will become that standard gesture that people can rely on to say, well, I'm not quite sure what to do next, so I'm just going to touch and hold, I'm going to give it a second, and then I'm going to discover what it is that I can do. So can everything be discoverable? So as I was researching this talk, there were a couple of features that I really struggled to figure out how I would actually add discovery to this feature. And I thought it might just be fun to finish by showing you a couple of those features. So did you know, for example, if you have an iPad and an Apple Pencil, if you swipe in from a corner of the screen, it takes a screenshot and automatically puts you in annotation mode? Who knew that? A few people, but certainly not the majority. I don't know how you would make this more discoverable than it is, because by this feature, first of all, you have to be using the Apple Pencil to even make this feature available. And so where on earth would you put any kind of discoverability UI for this? Instead, you are going to potentially have features that are only discoverable via somebody actually telling somebody else about them. And that's actually what I want to talk about here on this. So there's a tweet a little while ago that I saw that was about a feature of scroll bars on iOS. So if you look at this, the video that was attached to this tweet, if you tap and hold, so once you make a scroll bar visible, if you then stop scrolling and tap and hold on the scroll bar, you can then get direct manipulation of the scroll position just by scrolling up and down the document. Who knew about that one? More people, actually, but still not everybody. So I discovered this through this tweet that's got like 14,000 views or something like that. So a lot of people saw it. But this wasn't from Apple. But there's no reason this tweet couldn't have been from Apple. There's no reason this tweet couldn't have been Apple or the company that has whatever software this is saying, actually, look at what you can do with our software. And discoverability isn't always inside your application. Sometimes it's actually in other third-party methods of kind of distribution, like, for example, Twitter. Yeah, you're not going to be doing TV advertising, but that's not to say that you can't use other channels to make your application discoverable. Oh, hello, Siri. So let's have a look at what we've actually got from what I've been saying this morning. A walkthrough at the beginning of your application isn't enough. I'm not saying don't use a walkthrough. They're okay, they have their place. And if people are interested in learning, then there's no problem with having that walkthrough there. But it's not enough. You're not done when you've done that walkthrough. Context and timing are really important. Don't this is again going back to that walkthrough, don't force people into an uninterruptible way to a bit of discoverability UI. Think about what you're actually going to try and get people to figure out about your application, and maybe use different bits of discovery throughout your user interface. Don't guess at what is hard to discover. You might have a gut feeling in your head of, well, maybe this feature I think needs some discoverability. But use analytics to figure out what is hard to discover, and then start to educate people around that. Educate at every opportunity, and that's really just to say, don't focus on only educating inside your application. Use other mechanisms to teach people about your application. Use Twitter, use Facebook, use whatever mechanism people are paying attention to educate people about your application. emphasize touch and hold and context menus. This is a new API. We really need to take advantage of it and stick that in our application as often as we possibly can. Because again, touch and hold for context menus is not going to interrupt people. It's not something that's ever going to get in the way of what people are trying to talk about. Don't do too much. Don't force too many of these prompts on people. But also, don't just kind of do a couple of these things and give up. This is a constant, ongoing battle towards educating people about your application. And with that, I hope I've made you think a bit more about how you can actually design your user interface for discoverability. Yeah, with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. Here are some of the places you can find me online, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Do we have time for questions?
We have time for question. Unfortunately, some people just commented about it's so cold. I know. Get the jacket later, yeah? Is there any questions for Dave? Here from the audience live? No. Okay. All good?
All right.
Cool.
Thank you very much,
Dave.
everybody.